to The Artist and the New Humanism, an evolutionary model for art history. Jeffrey Rubinoff's insights developed from his artistic process. They are rooted in his art and convey a deep understanding of collective memory. He describes art as the map of the human soul. As the artist navigates the unknown, each original piece adds to the collective memory. Rubinoff contends that the artist whose work is consciously rooted in the history of art possesses the chart for the evolution of group consciousness, and that the artist of mature conscience who maintains a dialogue with his or her predecessors and whose work synthesizes both metaphor and analogy can incite evolution in a society that has become stagnant. He argues that Western society is immersed in a long and deepening pattern of stagnation that was incited by the American use of nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, thus concluding the period of human development that he has identified as the age of agriculture. What follows is Rubinoff's insight on the need for humanism in art and his argument for a non-prescriptive narrative of art history that elevates art as essential to the evolution of consciousness. The social relationships necessitated and maintained by the advent of agriculture have been a central component of structuring human society for over 10,000 years. The concept of the end of the age of agriculture is highly consequential and requires a deeply thoughtful and thorough re-examination of the essential assumptions of our institutions and their evolutionary direction. A philosophy based on our evidentiary knowledge of evolution and our consequential place in nature can provide a basis for the development of the order of consciousness necessary to overcome the virulent, metaphorical forms of tribalism such as racism, nationalism, and religion. Overcoming this socially atavistic, dangerous reliance is exigent given the advent of nuclear weapons. Modern humans have evidently demonstrated a deep historical sense of awe manifested in perception of the sublime and the sacred. Tribalism, metaphorically transformed and self-inflicted by myths of monopolized divine favor, thrived through the age of agriculture by prescriptive narrative. Prescriptive narrative, so used, perpetuated the rule and continuous reward system of the warrior class. In spite of the Enlightenment in the West, this system remained extant through the terrible resurgence in the 20th century until it was finally and abruptly ended among technologically advanced nations by the deterrence of nuclear war. Art provides a means to experience the sacred beyond prescriptive narrative. Rubinoff is particularly concerned with the current state of the art world. He argues that mainstream artists and arts institutions have refused the calling to remain loyal to art history and expand human consciousness. This shift occurred in the late 1950s and early 60s when commercial galleries, leading museums, and arts academics canonized a group of young artists that included Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, and Roy Lichtenstein. Rubinoff contends that this group, the pop artists, attached their loyalty to the market instead of art history. The supremely ironic gesture, in his words, sent ripples through the art world. At the 2009 forum, as Karun just mentioned, I reported on the state of pop art in 1964-65 and considered the enduring legacy of the World's Fair, where it was first exposed to a mass audience, alongside the real and visionary products of the military-industrial complex. This is just a poster for the war and a couple of the favorite exhibitions. At the time, notable figures in the art world issued statements warning that pop art actually contributed to this grossly hubristic display instead of challenging it, as the artists themselves argued. Nevertheless, the pop artists' interpretations of their own work within this social context and their stance of ironic absurdity, in Jeff's words, soon eclipsed all others. The World's Fair also marked the ascendance of postmodern theory in the art world, with a new prescribed narrative for the history of art and the potential of the artist. In ensuing decades, few canonical artists have produced work that is rooted in art history, this is Jeff's contention, or engages in or promotes the evolution of consciousness. Amidst this crisis, Rubinoff challenges artists of mature consciousness to return to art history, to produce works that promote and extend the process of evolution. Rubinoff moved here to Hornby Island to set up a one-man foundry and fabrication studio and has labored for 3.5 decades, I'm sure most of you know, to make his work accessible to the public in perpetuity for the establishment of the Sculpture Park and Foundation. It is a space for the public to reconnect to art history and its highest purposes of art through thoughtful contemplation of the sculptural works in concert with the landscape. Here, the viewer's body and personal narrative can take on many new elements while contemplating his or her own position within the process of evolution, which includes the development of trees, mountains, individual conscience, and human social systems. While it is accessible to a diverse audience, Rubinoff is particularly interested in reaching creative artists and arts educators of mature conscience, in acknowledgement of their potential to evolve through consciousness. Rubinoff's practice is rooted in an awareness of the evolutionary potential of art, which he imparts on park visitors. He describes the importance of this history of art this way: art is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is proof of the journey. As the artist navigates the unknown, the art adds to the collective memory. The artist's journey on the path of art history takes him to the farthest reaches of his predecessor as his point of departure. The artist who follows that history then possesses the chart for evolution, which he is in turn obliged to extend to his successors. As an art historian who shares many of these concerns over the present state of the art world, I too am interested in encouraging and promoting the work of artists who have the potential to evolve consciousness. For these reasons, today I will be exploring the means through which Rubinoff promotes evolution in his work and how it imbues his creative process. Rubinoff has cultivated a non-prescriptive, we've heard a little about this already, non-academic narrative of art history that could be invaluable to other artists of mature conscience. I will expand his reference space by reviving the work of post-war philosopher Herbert Reed, who, recognizing the crucial need for the expansion of human mental existence in his own time, promoted a similar model for art history in the 1950s. Rubinoff considers music to be sculpture in elastic space and transposes the concept of musical counterpoint to sculpture, which is music in plastic space. His works are unified through the harmonic interplay of positive and negative forces that extend to the natural environment. You could just also look outside at this point instead of looking at the screen. Because counterpoint is by nature non-prescriptive, artworks composed in accordance with its principles can play an important role in the evolution of consciousness. Rubinoff utilizes counterpoint as a means of approaching the sacred through art, arguing that the perceptive experience fills a fundamental spiritual need that pop art failed even to acknowledge. In his insight on the end of the age of agriculture, he identified the most powerful institutions of that age, tribalism, religion, nationalism, and racism, as being perpetuated through prescriptive narratives. Once it was taken to the nuclear extreme, he argues, the logic governing the institutions of the age of agriculture became self-undermining. Rubinoff is a strong advocate for a new humanism to promote the evolution of consciousness at the present. As I will explain, there's a thread of scholarship from the ancient world that acknowledges the artist as uniquely situated to approach the sacred and promote the evolution of consciousness. Some theories on evolution focus on periods of crisis and change in human history, pinpointing the adaptive creative models, including the visual and performed, through which abstract ideas could be contemplated. I will draw from sources that elevate both the human creative process and the aesthetic experience as fundamental to evolving consciousness. This evolutionary model for art history is inherently humanist. Working outside the conventional training grounds for young artists seeking fame and the favor of the market, Rubinoff cultivated a dialogue with his artistic predecessors, including Michelangelo. Oops. And a couple of details of his Florence Pietà. Kandinsky, fellow sculptor David Smith, and composers Bach and Schoenberg, he forged his own non-prescriptive narrative by pursuing works that responded to a deep evolutionary instinct to evolve consciousness in their own time. Post-war scientific and design culture promoted a dystopian view of the future by promoting either man's destructive potential or the irreversibility of his recent actions. The prescribed narrative of this unresolved chapter of our recent history marginalized and largely scienced the many artists and scholars who insist that humans should be centered in the effort to understand the present. Reed was among these scholars, and in the 50s he argued passionately that human consciousness can evolve or expand after a period of great trauma. He demonstrated that humans have repeatedly survived trauma throughout history and that we can forge a new reality by evolving consciousness. The key to evolution of consciousness, according to Reid, is that the image preceded the idea, and this is very important. The artist forged a new reality, and human consciousness evolved in the process of comprehending the abstracted reality presented in visual form. In the 1950s, Reid promoted a new narrative of art history to track the evolution of consciousness. This vitalist, humanist project provided assurance that humans could adapt to their new reality. In 1953, Reid gave the Norton Lectures at Harvard, at which he presented a series of talks on the function of art in the development of human consciousness. He acknowledged that the idea is latent in the neglected works of several earlier writers. By his own description, Reid extended their arguments to visual symbols and synthesized them with evolutionary biology to understand the development of human consciousness in the broadest sense. He argued that the image always precedes the idea in the development of human consciousness, and thus our history of culture and art, our philosophies and educational systems should be reconsidered in this context. He also emphasized that the aesthetic experience is an essential factor in human evolution on which, and this is a quote, Homo sapiens has depended for the development of the highest cognitive faculties. Reid proposed only a foundational outline, as you'll see, for what he knew would be an immense project. It is worthwhile for us to consider it because his and Rubinoff's ideas intersect at many points. Devising a new narrative of art history that considers the image as a precedent for the idea and the idea as essential to the evolution of human consciousness acknowledges the potential of art as a permanent form and highlights interconnections between creative works across time. Reid's project relates to this forum and the mission of the park in several ways. I will highlight some of the works he selected as exemplary of the role of art in the development of human consciousness. I should emphasize that his survey is a marked departure from the story of art history that has dominated for 2 centuries and to a large extent dictates the structure of arts education and artistic practice in the present day. Mainstream art history charts the progression of style and concept. Michel Foucault would assert, of course, that art history produced its own disciplinary frame, and thus it cannot envision an approach beyond it. Reid's model is a significant departure from conventional surveys of art. He argued that there has been no significant expansion of technical ability from the time of the cave painters, an example from Lascaux, to Michelangelo, Sistine ceiling here, or later artists. He postulated that the area of real expansion has been an aesthetic awareness and demonstrated that the arts enable man step by step to comprehend the nature of things. Art, as he wrote, has never been an attempt to grasp reality as a whole. That is beyond our human capacity. His survey tracks what he called the decisive stages in man's aesthetic apprehension of reality and demonstrates how the human mind successively conquested the definite modalities of existence. These 7 stages are the animal, the human, the intellectual, the numinous, the transcendental, the real, and the superreal. In stage 1, Reid considered the genesis of what he called the specifically human consciousness, defined as not yet being logical or aware of causality, but having some awareness of synchronicity. He argued that humans first developed a sign to confirm the sense of synchronicity, or that is, of course, 2 events happening at the same time in different places. This sign could be separated from the immediate circumstances and stored in memory. Thus, the individual could conceive a certain goal, such as a killed animal or stores of berries, and take the necessary action to procure it. He cited the finger drawings in the top left corner at Pechmerle and Lascaux on the right as early examples of recognizable symbols emerging in visual forms used to accomplish specific goals. A symbol or objective image, as he explained, served as an enlargement of experience. The activity of hunting and preparing to hunt could be repeated, and 2 or more experiences could be combined simultaneously and unconsciously. Over time, as consciousness increased, the distance between symbol and experience decreased through familiarity. Most importantly, they could be compared. In this early stage, Reed argued memory became a vital function. Thus, the development and aesthetic recognition of symbolic forms was integral to the expansion of consciousness. In the earliest stages of art making and aesthetic experience, Reed observed two different pursuits. The first is an outward realization of the image, and the second is the inward sensation. He identified the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic culture, in which groups of humans ceased to be nomadic and developed settlements sustained by agriculture and domesticated animals, as stage 2. He analyzed Neolithic aesthetic production in several forms. Among the works he cited as exemplary of this period are Tlingit, basketry, and is that the closest pronunciation? Tlingit. A couple of examples here, and Egyptian pottery, and here I only have his diagram. He was mostly interested in the geometric patterns of early Egyptian pottery. He determined that most Neolithic artworks are characterized by formal composition. The finished artwork is not an imitation of a given prototype, but an isolation, this is his quote, of form from its practical function and the transference of this disembodied form to quite a different context. The image is not, as he wrote, retained in all its actuality, rather it is transformed. In basket making and pottery, he discerned an awareness of pattern and volume. Producing pattern and weaving involves the creation of geometric patterns by the manipulative action of the hands and fingers. Pottery involves shaping a plastic material into volume. He theorized that the ability to comprehend abstract imagery evolved through abstraction from practical activities, thus endorsing the theory that art represents the fulfillment of what is desired. Reed also emphasized that the human faculty to understand abstraction forms the foundation of logic, science, and the scientific method. Although we may regard geometric patterning as unimaginative, even primitive, Reed suggested it is an unmistakably and vitally humanist pursuit. He highlighted some of the abstract references to the organic world that appear in Neolithic design, a couple of examples in pottery here. And then one example, obviously the Book of Duro is much later, the 8th century, but he's interested in the much older patterning that includes some animal forms. The craftsman could, for example, observe the effectiveness of symmetrical design in nature, in the bodies of mammals, and even the human form. These new faculties of abstract thought eventually led to the development of effective symmetrical tools, such as the axe head. Later Neolithic productions, such as the Great Lyre from the royal tombs at Ur, here he's looking at the top sort of narrative illustration. There's a lion tamer or animal tamer and then animals on each side. Often contained animal subject matter, presumably a reflection of activities related to the domestication of animals. The artist had to create works that showcase the tamer's magical power over the animal. And here with the knife, looking at the image on the top, on the detail on the right. Another area in which human consciousness expanded in this stage was in the ability to comprehend approximate symmetry. That is, a composition in which the features are not mirrored from left to right, but instead are carefully arranged to achieve a sense of equal weight on both sides. This effect can be observed in several examples here. I've just brought in a few slides. The carved limestone plaque, we see the king of Lagash. Fortunately, it's incredibly dark. As a builder, a relief showing Ashurnasirpal III of Assyria. Reed asserted that it requires an aesthetic awareness of balance to understand an asymmetrically balanced composition as this one. The comprehension of visual unity involves the synthetic mental process that was a development of consciousness, a leap forward in the apprehension of reality. Reed argued that the orderly perception developed by Neolithic humans was a biological evolutionary necessity, hence the consciousness of beauty. The era of reported history has been largely defined by religion and, according to Reed, the states of human development that led to making a distinction between religion, magic, and science. This transition necessitated the evolution of what he called invisible agents manipulating objects that have a spatial or sequential relationship on some cosmic plan. Thus, in the next stage, art developed the human intelligence necessary for metaphysical faculty. So in this stage 3, God figures, as Reid described, were dematerialized in art and represented as a spirit and power with real but unseen existence. He argued that this awareness could only come about with a new appreciation of space as both an indefinite and finite continuum. Among the earliest surviving works that seem to reference this awareness is a painting of two adult figures. This is actually taken directly from Reid's book. Two adult figures you see mourning a dead child. It's featured on the 5th century Lakaitos. Once space could be experienced as it is here, as a thing in itself, an immaterial emptiness of infinite extension, as Reid observed, the human mind was open to the creation of transcendental religion in which gods could be relegated to heaven. Likewise, this space could open into an all-encompassing nothingness. Reid suggested that this process was a parallel evolution and perception, a parallel evolution of perception and representation. Transcendentalism was rooted in foundational religious myths, including the Garden of Eden, where the deity was correlated to infinity. Physical manifestations of this ideal began with the basic dome vault in Mesopotamia, you see here, in West Asia, the High Sophia. These constructions and were perhaps most fully realized in Gothic cathedrals. In this stage, the artist defined architectural space, and the philosopher or theologian was the one who filled it with God. The Greeks were likely the first to realize an objective image of man. Reid described the 4th stage as defined by the concept of human as ideal. As he suggested, it was inevitable that man would need to comprehend and represent the subjective source of all the images and symbols he creates in his attempt to construct an external reality that he should realize and represent the self. This process enabled humanist thought. In Greek vase painting and sculpture, Reid traced the expansion of consciousness from the expression of plastic harmony to the idealization of human form, noting the emergence of both an instinctive expressionism and growing idealism. His survey of these developments ranged in the earliest era from the Cycladic or Cycladic figures. So this is around 3200 BC. The Diplon crater, so here looking for the human forms with the sort of rectangular midsections. The Cleobis and Baiton, Kuroi from Delphi. The Exechius painting of Achilles and Ajax here playing dice before war. Apollo from Boeotia, and the Peplos and Weavers scenes from the Parthenon frieze. In Greece, the human consciousness attained a new dimension, Reid argued, that enabled the awareness of the perfect harmony of being and idea. Reid observed that as humans approach the modern epoch, it becomes difficult to differentiate between consciousness and the secondary pursuits of imagination and intellection. These points are key to our project to chart the evolution of consciousness and outline a non-prescriptive humanist history of art. Reid's analysis of modern development highlights the systems and institutions that intervened, to good and ill effect, in the expansion of aesthetic expression and perception. He called this 5th stage of evolution the illusion of the real. It's possible that the quandary of post-war art and its seeming inability to assess and speak to a changed landscape was actually the end point of a process set in motion centuries earlier. If we are to understand the failure of the 20th century art world to address the reality of nuclear winter, we must consider the early modern development of art and the points at which it departed, whether intentionally or not, from its role in evolving consciousness. In the modern era, as Reid described, art proceeded on the basis of tropes. In this period, schools and academies trained artists to accept established canons of expression that appealed to reason rather than the senses. Art students were typically discouraged from developing their own awareness of the visible world. Art became both a game and a science, he wrote, and the merging of the two produced confusion. One contradiction of this stage is that human consciousness was greatly extended as new dimensions of reality were discovered. In this era, it became more difficult to argue that aesthetic activity preceded coherent intellectual activity because sensation, imagination, feeling, and thinking were no longer separate and certainly not sequential processes. Philosophy, he noted, has since the Renaissance pursued a scientific method as opposed to art, which has become increasingly ambiguous. Reid drew a further distinction between the modern philosopher and artist by noting that the artist's efforts are an attempt to establish an individual clarity of conscience, a reality that the artist can perceive, and not a theory of reality or the nature of being. He suggested that consciousness was first corrupted in the modern era, the early modern era. At least as early as the 13th century, artists were pressured to deny their true feelings. This analysis led to Reid's theory that a truthful consciousness is the foundation of all genuine art. Bad, then, is the unsuccessful attempt to become conscious of a given emotion. The consciousness, which thus fails to grasp its own emotions, is a corrupt or untruthful consciousness. Reid pointed to the typical late medieval art object as a signal of untruthful consciousness. As he wrote, so many carved sculptures and other objects of this era display an artificiality because the underlying symbol is divorced from sensibility. Reid emphasized that not all medieval artists were working through false consciousness. Even in that period, a few artists remained rooted in the evolutionary principles of vitality and beauty and seem to have intentionally pursued a more organic aesthetic. These artists observed nature and natural phenomena, and gradually they transformed all types of art making and ornamentation in what emerged as a reaffirmation of classical humanism. Here are a couple of good examples. They're commonly produced tapestries and showing on floral backgrounds, and then moving into Giotto and their Arena Chapel. And Masaccio, his tribute money, I'll talk about it again in a second. This new effort of consciousness was required if art was not to perish amidst the plagues and wars and general weariness of spirit that characterized the late Gothic era. Reid's account of this revolution through expansion of aesthetic form gives us hope for a similar movement in our own time. Just as in the Renaissance, present-day arts academies and institutions have a tendency to obscure such precedents in the evolution and adaptation of art in the past. This is yet another reason why it's imperative to develop an evolutionary model for art history today. Proponents of sociocultural art history deny that an evolutionary need would have been fulfilled through the dissemination of humanist subjects in art. These scholars argue that fully modeled human figures and the believable recession of space that typify humanist Renaissance works functioned primarily as a tool of the newly wealthy merchant princes who exploited aesthetic creation to attack the philosophies and political systems of the feudal order. So the Botticelli is just often cited as sort of in support of this interpretation. While conventional art history focuses on the plastic arts, as Reid discovered, from time to time one form of imagination, this is his phrase, took precedence in the expansion of consciousness. In such cases, the ideas contained in one form of expression were often not translated to another medium for decades, even centuries in some cases. He described how St. Francis evolved consciousness through poetry and oral tradition, to which he introduced both freer rhythms and new subject matter to address ethical concepts like poverty and chastity. This evolution of consciousness occurred in poetry long before Giotto, and Sassetta, for example, realized, and both these were chosen because St. Francis is represented in them, realized these ideas in plastic form. A true history of the evolution of consciousness, Reid argued, would follow the arts in their separate courses to pinpoint when one form of imagination takes precedent over others, and for what reasons. In the 15th century, Sassetta realized the transformative potential of the legends of St. Francis in visual form at roughly the same time that a group of artists, including Van Eyck, Masaccio, whose work we just saw, and Conrad Witz, produced an aesthetic illustration of a new sense of being that was not linked to Franciscan thought. These artists asserted that through self-creation, humans have substantial empirical existence. Reid pinpointed this affirmation of an imperishable objective world in the paintings of Duccio. So he was especially interested in a detail, the calling of the apostles Peter and Andrew from, I think it's on the back side. But as he demonstrated, and Giotto, so should have brought it in, Giotto. Just to let you have a minute to look at these, the Kiss of Judas. So these are just important scenes from the life of Christ, the Kiss of Judas on the left and the Lamentation on the right. So as Reid demonstrated, another century passed before this new consciousness of real existence was fully realized in the work of Masaccio. The artist who extended this idea provided an exact account of external reality, which is only possible in the absence of idealism and symbolic forms that might corrupt it. Giotto and Masaccio created a real, substantial presence for the human figure and opportunities for interaction with others in the same spatial continuum. Also pertinent to our discussion of contemporary art is Reid's assertion that this process of realization was filled with conflict. The fact that Masaccio rendered his consciousness of space and substance without resorting to cliches is proof of his fitness as an artist of good, what Reid called good, Jeff calls mature consciousness. While some of his artistic descendants extended his innovations, another fatal disassociation of sensibility occurred in art in the 16th century with the rise of what we now call the Mannerist style. Here we are, one example in painting, this example from the Palazzo del Te, or sort of mural design that incorporates the entire room. Out of the conceptual notion of real space emerged an illusion of the real that artists were expected to achieve through established methods and conventions. Reid described this style as one in which an infinite refinement of accepted symbols took place, and as a parallel or consequent development, there was an infinite refinement of imagination and thought. Reid's survey repeatedly highlights the points at which one thread of consciousness expansion was eventually corrupted. At such a juncture, the student of evolutionary art history simply pursues another area in which consciousness continues to expand. In his own practice, Rubinoff has located many such moments. Bach, for example, he often points this out to visitors, expanded consciousness through musical counterpoint in the mid-18th century, but those concepts were not employed in the visual arts until the 20th. Reid described the sixth stage in the evolution of consciousness as marked by attempts to circumvent aesthetic ideals and present not the illusion of the real, but the reality of consciousness itself, subjective reality. He traced this thread of expansion that began in the Renaissance with self-portraits of Leonardo, Titian, Rembrandt, and was fully realized in the later work of El Greco and Francisco Goya. He argued that these artists were among the first to probe, especially in their self-portraits, to probe below the mask of the cultivated persona, to visualize an inner subjective state irrespective of outward appearance. Reid also surveyed self-portraits produced by three modern artists. The first of these is Friedrich's. According to Reid, it projects the intensity of his ravaged mind. Friedrich, as Reid said, was exacting in this expression, while Van Gogh's self-portrait is distorted. After Van Gogh, Reid observed a progressive disintegration of the outer or objective image and the substitution of symbolic forms that represent inner feeling. Symbols were incorporated within the mask, which was distorted until it became a mask of terror, projecting the darker aspect of the human psyche that is normally concealed. He suggested that this development reached its limit in Paul Klee's self-portrait of 1919, where, and this is a quote, "all objective record of the lineaments is lost, and the symbol of the self exists in self-sufficient independence." Reid's survey of this pursuit of subjective reality extends to the 20th century and includes the work of Sam Francis. So I don't have green oil, but here's Big Red, and Jackson Pollock. He suggested that through abstraction and seeming formlessness, these artists observe the self in isolation. Reid identified the constructive image of the environment as the seventh and final stage, observing it in romantic poetry and paintings. In this stage, artists and poets such as Wordsworth promoted the concept that their work revealed a reality that already existed on a transcendental plane. They also purported to create a whole new reality. He discounted the contemporaneous work of Cézanne, Mont Saint-Victoire, as a product of a corrupted consciousness because the artist utilized, as Reid said, conceptual modes of cognition in the perceptual process of art. These tools, he argued, destroy the aesthetic validity of representation. A sense of reality, as he wrote, should never be confused with a sense of optics. He characterized the first stage of cubism as interesting. So an example here on the left by Brock, as another corruption of consciousness, but in the synthetic phase, and the example on the right is by Picasso, as a vital stage, because its goal was to adapt the forms of nature to a sensuously determined picture space of geometrical structure. In works like Juan Grie's composition number 2, reality is no longer an external illusion to be visualized. Instead, the canvas was intuitively divided into forms of ideal reality to which external objects must conform. It is a return to the ideals of the Neolithic artists. Reid suggested that modernist abstract and geometrical art was the logical conclusion of this development. Grie's experiment was extended by various artists, including Piet Mondrian, whose work evolved intuitively from figuralism here to synthetic cubism, and then to a completely non-figurative stage. Mondrian espoused art that achieves a true reality instead of an illusion. He wrote, "To create pure reality plastically, it is necessary to reduce natural forms to the constant elements of form, and natural color to primary colors." Reid summarized this expression of pure reality through abstraction as a process of dehumanization, meaning the liberation of the human form from representation. Mondrian envisioned a future in which art would point toward the reconstruction of the environment, for that was where expansion would occur in the nuclear age. As Reid noted, this new vision of the environment is particularly necessary in the aftermath of the atomic bomb. Mondrian promoted a new form and practice that, being purely constructive, in his words, will aid the creation of an environment not merely utilitarian or rational, but also pure and complete in its beauty. Parallel to this notion, Rubinoff espouses a new synthesis achieved through the dynamic engagement of truth with both analogy and metaphor. He argues that artists must work with one brain, drawing from both the left and right lobes to touch the sacred in art. When viewing works created by such an artist, the viewer of mature consciousness can also access what Reid called the amorphous realm of feeling of forms that are significant or symbolic. On the basis of this activity, symbolic discourse becomes possible, and through it, humans can expand their awareness of the nature of reality. To understand how Reid's model for an evolutionary art history is relevant to our situation, we must turn to Rubinoff's insight on modernism and the new synthesis. A key concept, as he describes, is the carryover that life opportunities are not divinely ordained, but can be distributed equally based on merit, and that the corresponding changes in social organization can be implemented. This is the means by which civilization itself can evolve. In advocating for a humanist narrative of art history, we must consider the current state of the academy and question why it does not seek or promote an evolutionary narrative. The academy is dominated by postmodern thought, and while there are many theories of postmodernism in the arts and many methods of pursuing these ideas, the one constant seems to be that humanism is no longer possible. In general, postmodern theory departs from the assumption that the modernist enterprise was a colossal failure and that it destroyed itself in World War II. Postmodernism questions modernist notions of progress, including the humanist tradition. It promotes the idea that human life has floundered in the aftermath of modernism's demise, And postmodernism contends that there are no universals, that all ideas and developments are relative. Because postmodern analysis is focused on the process by which social and visual norms are constructed, art production is necessarily located within socio-historical reality. Postmodern theory holds that art will not change human actions, and thus there is no consideration, well, this is generally speaking, of evolution of consciousness. If one were to describe the current scene in broad terms, neo-Dada, and maybe in a few cases, nihilistic neo-Dada might be accurate. And so a few examples, at least that are neo-Dada, maybe, but definitely some art stars in the last 25 years. Jeff Koons on the left, Damien Hirst on the right, and recently there's been a real flair for Chinese art that is tapped into the whole sort of language of globalization. One example here. While there are many practicing artists who seek and elevate humanist values, their pursuits are typically not promoted as enthusiastically by the art establishment. In addition to discussing the problem with postmodern theory as it relates to the teaching of art history, we should acknowledge the impact of the dominant theoretical approach to anthropology for the past half-century. As Dennis Dutton describes the general direction of opinion in the field, it has been toward the denial of a human psychological nature, other than what might have been constructed by local cultural conditions. Dutton edits the widely influential website Arts and Letters Daily, and recently initiated a project to seek and promote a pre-theoretical understanding of what art is. As he describes it, such an understanding would allow us to recognize broad intuitions about everyday experience, including cross-cultural and historical experience. If viewers rely only on the critical framework of Western art, Dutton argues, we are incapable of understanding aesthetic expression in other areas and by other cultures. As he observed, the conviction that we can't understand them and that they can't understand us is self-fulfilling in the system. Dutton's concern with this phenomenon is a signal, perhaps, of increasing awareness that the criteria of the art world are flawed. He articulates the need to create a more general criteria that acknowledges the primary function of art as, in his words, intensifying experience, enhancing it, extending it in time, and making it coherent. He argues that art criticism needs to be premised on an understanding of evolution and not purely on the abstract theory. I mention his work, published just last year, not because his model itself will provide a way forward, but because I suspect he is representative of a growing number of art academics who might recognize a significant lack in our current system. A non-prescriptive art history that values human evolution stresses the potential of the image to impact others, and thereby group consciousness. This conviction is essential to the park's mission and its ongoing activities. An evolutionary art history affirms that art is key to human survival. We join Herbert Reed in the search for a vitalism in aesthetic expression, concurring that it is the best means for challenging the nihilism that dominates the art world. As he wrote, modern nihilism in philosophy and art is the violent outcry of a disillusioned idealism. A non-prescriptive evolutionary narrative for the history of art is neither idealistic nor totalizing. It is a tool that empowers the artist and viewer to cultivate new connections and interconnections in art history, to address and comprehend our current reality and the institutions that govern it, and to provide the image through which group consciousness can be evolved. The proposition that the artist is obliged to art history and to evolution before the academy and the market is essential to this project.
Thank you. Yeah.
Two questions. First, I wonder, where does Reed get the notion that perception comes before conception, that image comes before idea? It's so arresting and so challenging, in some ways so perverse, that I wonder where it comes from. I mean, is this his surrealist notion that, you know, if you're stuck with the mind like optics and Matisse, then you're going to not see reality, which is surreal? Is that where, it's just a question to elucidate. And the second issue is a more general one. I wonder whether there is a danger in all, is this right, Jeffrey? I wonder, in general interpretations of all the history of art, in that they involve rejections. They involve people who are not part of the pantheon, like Matisse in this case. I'm just choosing him as one instance. So they're always about arbitrary choices that you could say that there's room for multiple cycles of the history of art from the beginning till now. And having one, which is these stages, strikes me as prescriptive, which is where we're not going to go. So I was wondering about that is there a sense that Reed is very much a William Morris follower, a socialist, a man who is a prescriptive political thinker, and whose politics actually lies behind this necessary series of stages, which is in my view, one of its limitations. But the first one I'm really puzzled about. Why does the image come before the idea?
I think you're probably right. There's not a lot in specifically in his work where he's addressing the need for an evolutionary art history. I mean, you probably know more about his total body of work than I do, and can sort of pull from other sources maybe to infer. I'm sure that the Surrealist project is part of it. I mean, he does make reference to German poetry, 19th century German poetry, and says that idea is obvious there. Some developments in evolutionary biology, and I can give you a couple of names of scholars I had never heard of until I read his references to them. Cassirer, I think.
Cassirer is a great philosopher.
Yeah. I don't really know necessarily that he addressed that point, but he just sort of mentioned them all in sort of a pantheon, I guess, of predecessors who supported this idea. I haven't really thought as much about how this project plays into sort of a mandate, if any, mostly because I'm interested in adapting this model for the present. Jeff may have, certainly will have different ideas than I do for how useful it might be. I guess I'm wary of creating another prescriptive narrative. I was talking to Leba and Karun about this. I'm sure we'll draw this out a bit more. And I wonder if maybe the best use for this is just an example so that each artist can cultivate a series of references.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Jeff.
About the notion that the image comes before the idea, that this is something that has an ancient history. It's very difficult if you imagine people that didn't understand what light was. Let's take the ancient Greeks, for example. What is vision? The thought was, well, when I see something, I see you people at the back of the room, it's quite impossible that you, as material beings, enter my mind. But something of you enters my mind. So the idea of what enters my mind is your form. The Greek word for form is eidos, E-I-D-O-S in English letters, from which we get the word idea and also the word video, because it was the basis of the explanation of both ideas and video. The notion was that we are informed, that is, the form of the things come into us, so I can look at the room, which is much larger than my head, and nevertheless the form would fit in my head. Even if I'm a materialist, and we're a Greek materialist as well, atomist, it will still fit. And we still have something like that. What's in our head, we want to say, is pictures, ideas of pictures. And then the thought comes that ideas themselves are somehow or other abstractions from those original pictures. Now, a more modern theory is that abstraction doesn't make any sense. This is a very, very quick potted history. The thought was, well, I see various dogs, and then I have to have, as it were, an idea of dog, which is neither the idea of a Pekingese nor a Great Dane, neither white nor brown. And the question is, what does it look like? If you take out everything that's different between different dogs, you're left with no image. This was replaced about the time of the British empiricists by David Hume, and now is a theory that's sort of continuous with various kinds of connectionist architectures of the mind as a kind of a structure of the way that system works as an information processor, is that it's an associationist net. That is, the word dog, as a sound, calls into your mind various images of dogs. And then you will pick the one that seems most relevant. So if I say to you, for instance, this morning I saw a dog cross the road, I can almost immediately turn to someone like Liba and say, you understood what I said, right? Or as I was driving, I saw a dog. I could ask you, what sort of dog did you picture? And you probably have a picture in your mind, and you can probably tell me, actually, I pictured a little white dog or something. So this is the modern notion. So the image comes into the mind as the form of the object, leaving behind its matter but containing its form. And then that image itself is the stuff out of which ideas are constructed.
That's the opposite of the gospel. The beginning
Yes.
was the word.
Exactly.
Which is Greek
Plato,
as well. It's the opposite.
Plato turned it on its head, and other people did as well. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, it's on, because we had a conversation on the ferry about memory as a collage, and how, I wonder if you could maybe expand on that, the advances in neurobiology.
Well, this is, I'm sure you know this as well, the notion of memory as a computer data bank is totally discredited by neurophysiology. And most of the neurophysiological research is about the associative collage, is bringing different senses to bear upon the reconstruction of an event, which always changes at every reconstruction. Every memory is different from every previous one. So the old computer metaphor is just completely out the window among scientists.
Well, the old computer, but some sense of computation or information
that's
processing is left.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Old. Yeah. Yeah. No, there's much more sophisticated ways of dealing with it.
I've been working with navigation programs
Yeah.
that were probably developed basically to drop in.
I think you got two microphones? Oh. I mean, Jenny, maybe.
Is it me?
Or maybe not.
No,
Sorry.
only one.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the new computers are using programming that was adapted from the military for dropping a missile on a dime. And so you can navigate through that space with a whole series of complexity that is very unlike old computers.
I think, Jeff, the point that I've understood, and again, it's through a glass darkly, what I've understood in the science is that every navigation is different and unpredictable. That's the difference. I think what you have are a series of algorithms that will allow you to navigate through a diamond every single time that you try, whereas the presumption of neurology is that they're you change.
When you begin, you start with empty space, completely empty space. And so the idea of line, figure, and 3 dimensions all have to be invented right at that particular point. Will it remember it specifically once it's done? Yes, it will remember the experience, but then it's very similar to a sculpture. Then it's there every time you go to visit it. Every time you go to visit it, your perception is going to be different, and your memory is going to be different. But to that extent, it deals with extraordinary variables, nonlinear variables that you wouldn't think of like in doing an Excel program, for example, where you're going to get linear variables. It deals with nonlinear mathematics, and the consequences of it is as you begin to draw truly in 3 dimensions. But there's nothing there. And the best ones are surface modelings rather than solid models, because the solid models tend to be that way, but the truly nonlinear ones are surfaces. And so the surfaces are put together into a solid, and it appears to only be a solid. So it's a very, very complex set of... As you're drawing with a program like that, you're thinking in 3 dimensions. You're actually thinking in 3 dimensions, but you're really working in many others, and you're violating all the rules of physics because your objects can pass through space and pass through each other. They don't occupy space. And it's a very strange interrelationship that you have. But yes, I would say that's the model.
Well, in that regard, I'm trying to get a notion of whether Reed had a theory, as it were, of artistic memory, of aesthetic memory. That the reason why he wanted this model was to talk about the repertoire available to you or to any artist today, which has.
I thought he defined it a little too carefully and a little too subjectively, but that was something that I wanted to raise from one of your 3 forms of memory.
Yes.
I wanted to add aesthetic memory. I also wanted to add evolutionary memory.
But the more levels we get, I think the more likely it is that we appreciate the sheer impossibility of talking about collective memory.
What I mean by but if you look at what I mean by collective memory, I mean the total knowledge of the human soul, which is like doesn't belong to anyone, but rather only the extents of it are capable of being known. And so the artist that's mapping it or moving it in evolution is actually moving that basis of knowledge together. And that knowledge base is the universal knowledge base for all of human beings. It moves forward, and it's not fixed in time. It moves forward and grows. It evolves.
How do we have access to it? I mean, it sounds like some kind of...
To it.
My question was, where is memory, we talked about this as aesthetic memory, is there are the stages important to talk about a series of levels, almost archaeologically, levels of aesthetic construction that Reed is going through one after another?
He focuses on expansion of mental, what is the phrase he uses? It's more an issue of expansion instead of a need to remember.
Is it capacities that are expanded?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Consciousness
But there's actually another phrase, I'll think of it in a second. But expansion of experience to him, I think it's sort of, I imagine it's sort of creating a footprint, like expanding a footprint. But one thing that I didn't really push as much as I would like to, and maybe we can do in discussion, is that he was mostly interested in aesthetic experience, more so than just expansion of consciousness in the artist, right? So it's in a large community, and I think we haven't really focused on that enough. No. Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, yes.
You write about artists who, quote, succeeded in rendering his consciousness of space and substance without resorting to cliches or denying his own sensation. I don't really understand what this means. How do we know what these artists did or did not do? Is this some determination made, say, in the 20th century?
Yes.
Or was there some controversy over what they did? I find these phrases empty of meaning that I can understand first off,
Yeah.
or I don't know if there's some peg to hang them upon.
I don't really have a sense that there's a peg. I mean, there's a lot of hyperbolic language. And, I mean, I guess for me, obviously that's a direct quote. For me, the best use, again, I want to explore the best use of this model that Reed laid out, and certainly I'm not pushing this specific understanding of the work of these other artists. I mean, I think it's problematic in some areas.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit too vague and ambiguous.
Yeah.
But still, I do think there's some value in artists sort of forming new interconnections based on maybe their own set of criteria.
Can you go back to that slide that you were particularly talking about?
Is this the
Let me
late
get-
medieval?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
15th century cliche.
almost there.
There it is. Yeah. I'm not an art historian. I don't have the academic background, but it was quite clear to me what you said. I mean, just the. But again, maybe I'm misinterpreting it. But it is sort of. I think he is just intuitively interpreting this. I don't know that there's a way of trying. To me, it seems very artificial, and I don't know, Jeff, you have something to say about this, but this is what you're referring to, or what Reed was referring
Yes,
to?
this
Okay.
phrase was in reference to this period, the medieval art.
One of the things I disagree with, and I'll talk about tomorrow, and I've just completely left it out, is artists as illustrators. And artists as illustrators really are the function that goes on prior to, tomorrow I'll talk about it, but a definition of written history begins with the Greeks and with the necessity, from the Greek point of view, of examining the origins of war and re-examining them.
Yeah.
But the records were kept for about 1,500 years before that. And the records that were kept were based on the artists as illustrators. And when I point out in my work, and I know that he's getting to it, but I saw many things that he gave as examples that I would have put into that category, is that those things that don't cross over into art are non-events as far as the history of art is concerned from an artist's point of view. They're just non-events. This is a non-event. And what's important to the history of art is, for artists, which I'll point out tomorrow, is that the actual crossing over of art into art, for artists, not necessarily art historians, is the event. And so that's the event itself. And if that area is not crossed over into, and I know that he knows that, but what he's doing is he's enlarging a concept which I just knocked out 3/4 of it, right there, of what he had, is on the basis that non-art is non-art. It just as a non-event as far as the history of art as artists are concerned, because there's nothing to speak to.
So
This is non-art.
So for Larry,
This illustrates, it's a prescriptive illustration. I don't know what the prescription is, but I almost guarantee you that there was, if you put this here and you put that there and you put this here and you put this person here and the way that you lay it out here, then you've got a work of art. It's painting by numbers.
it is that fill in, connect
Yeah,
the
it's
dots.
painting by numbers. Painting by numbers.
I'm asking this because I'm sure you'll have the answer. No, I want to know, I want to understand, really understand the difference between that and a Gregorian chant. So the Gregorian chant is entirely prescriptive in the sense of being utterly meaningless outside of a series of practices. Practices are what give them their being. But within them, they have some abstract beauty that may
They begin writing counterpoint. The word counterpoint comes from sticking pins in. It's a little points that they gave. And it's a very strange musical language that they begin with. But the monks start writing counterpoint into the Gregorian. And that's the part that begins to separate it out. Why progress beyond it? I only use why progress beyond it on the basis that it's a complete work in voice. And that why would musicians go beyond it, right? It's complete in and of itself. Partly because I don't understand the language of the prescription. So there may be a prescription there, just as I probably don't understand the language here, and I fit it. And then the question is, well, why go beyond this? And that really is the question. Why go beyond this? This is very complete. To many people, this would be a complete work of art. It's got pictures, it's got story, it's got carving, it's got space. It has all of those things.
And it's sacred, yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I don't have to understand it. It looks very complete to me. Why go beyond that? And that's really the issue. I think that's really the issue on the breaking out. Everything flattened out after after the Roman times. I don't know why. It seems to have been very stylized. But that's one of the aspects, again, I'll talk about tomorrow, is that as illustration becomes stylized, it just becomes stylized. And you can see it in Chinese painting. You're going to get a line, and that line is going to be a very prescribed line, and it's going to go from painting to painting, and it's not going to have anything to do with anything ecclesiastical. It's going to be what's prescribed in terms, a well-known potter here practiced in Japan. He was Chinese, he practiced in Japan, and he once said to me, he said, the difference between North America and Japan is that artists in North America are expected to have an individual identity and work on an individual identity, but artists in Japan are expected to work on a group identity, the identity. It's supposed to be Japanese. There's an identity that goes with the way that they work. And so I would say that our Western perception of art, or the way that we perceive art now, is definitely on an individual basis. So the prescription is going to be on how the artists themselves may prescribe how this is done and how it must be done. And I know that when he was in Japan, this is what it was about. It's done this way, you know, and you're only allowed a little bit of variation in that particular thing, which is only to like maybe move that way a little bit, and so that you can put your own name on it. But if you break that prescription on how you move, then it's not valuable at all. So we've seemed to have taken it the opposite. So what's going on in here is probably a total artistic prescription as to what's supposed to be going on in here, whatever that happens to be, as with the Gregorian chant. But the part that I would say that's going on in there from an artist's point of view in terms of prescription, it really isn't the ecclesiastical. It has no meaning at all. It's the routine of, you do it this way, and it's saleable, and the church will buy it, and look, we'll move it through the studio. But he does a lot of that. He has far more work in that category than I would have allowed to be placed.
That artistic activity begins with finding yourself face to face with the visual. And I have problems with that. You could find yourself with a tactile, with an audio. You can hear a bird singing. You could feel something squishy. I don't think it has to be visual. I think it can be totally using any of your senses.
Reed, he focuses on visual in his survey, but he does emphasize that it can be in any form.
Yeah.
I mean, he uses the terminology symbol and image sort of interchangeably for various forms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So does image mean mental image?
I think so.
Literally,
Yeah, yeah.
and not like only.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be visual. I mean,
Two-dimensional.
we all learn differently. Some people can go to a lecture and they hear it. Other people have to touch it. Other people have to do it. Other people, you learn in different ways, and you express yourself in different ways. And I can't see where one way is the gospel, so to speak.
Yeah.
It just varies.
Oh, I think you're totally right. Any other questions from the
Yeah, there was a mic out there. If there's
ideas?
Okay. Too soon. I mean, is this on? Yes.
There are some other issues.
Yeah.
1953. Just think back to that moment. What is he speaking against in the history of art? Where had the history of art been that he wants to correct? This is clearly a corrective. It's a robust manifesto. It's a statement of a purpose and a direction of an impressive range. But what I don't understand is who is he burying in the course of this huge historical sweep?
I think connoisseurship was really dominant of the early 20th century. I mean, that has to be one point of attack. That might not be the only one, but that Bernard Berenson and others. I mean, they sort of pushed discussions of art really to just considering, trying to authenticate and looking at like the way an artist renders ears and hands.
Oh, connoisseurship.
Yes, and so not considering any sort of social context. I don't think they really considered the life of the artist very much, and not even any sort of literature or any other sources for the analysis of symbols in society. So I think that might be one. I think he may be concerned that the focus has been moved too far away from the artist and the idea of the individual artist. That may be one issue. Yes.
Other thing is, some of these things just hit chords with me. I think it was on page 14, it says, you may regard geometric patterning as unimaginative. I don't.
Yeah, I think it's just,
I think it's
Reed just sort of said that in passing. I mean, I think just the population in general has a general disregard for weaving basket making, the sort of abstractions that we see in these forms.
But if you look at some of the Tlingit art, which is Alaskan and Pacific Northwest, much of it is very geometric. It's beautiful from my eye anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely art and it's definitely imaginative. So for someone to come out and say that that's not, I take total exception with it.
He's elevating that form and, sort of, I guess, bringing us full circle at the end there.
Yeah.
By, I guess, sort of emphasizing that Paul Klee and Mondrian are so closely linked.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that one of the dominant sort of methods of surveying art is to pursue the idea of a progression of style. And so he actually sort of explodes that whole model because he says that there's really been no significant increase in either technical ability or stylistic ability. That we just see the same thing sort of over and over. It's expansion of consciousness that he's concerned about. Yes.
Reed was a philosopher or historian of art. Can you give us some idea of how his ideas were received by artists? Did artists react to the things he was saying about their occupation?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that, actually. I don't know does anybody else happen to know how artists received?
So are artists in general unconcerned with what historians or philosophers say about what they do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of it. I was aware of it in the time, but they weren't relevant, and it's not likely to be relevant. Part of the problem with it is that it tends to grow out of aesthetics, and aesthetics tends to be an argument that artists just aren't going to get into. There was part of this was the lecture in 1953, wasn't it? Okay. Part of it is this very painful transition that art went through for about 5 different reasons, but 2 of the major ones is that as Europe collapsed in 1945, America became the ascendant culture. And Americans just absolutely weren't interested much in art at all. There's an argument that the CIA really pushed the American artist because there was a hegemony division between the Russians pushing traditional ballet and classical music as part of their propaganda, and Europeans loving it, really going for it, and Americans pushing a new modern world out there and fighting across it. And you saw it in Berlin prior, I mean, I was in Berlin in 1991, but you could just tell from 1945 to when the wall had just come down. That had been the split, and it just went right down the middle of Berlin, and you just see it.
At this point, the theory.
No,
it's
but
very
that's okay.
well-founded,
That's okay.
yeah.
I bring it up because it was a very, very painful transition that seems to be significantly less painful in music to move from a liturgy or a pictorial or a verbal or a storytelling narrative in music to going to the abstract world. It managed to make transitions that didn't seem to have been a major argument among either the patrons. Now, it's possible in the time it really was really controversial, and it's possible it was really controversial over 150 years, but nobody seems to think that it was much. Partly because the musicians didn't necessarily have a good enough voice to stay with their music or even perform their own music, but they had the skill to play a prosthetic in the same way that I use a computer now to draw 3-dimensionally. They use their instruments, and there's no real difference between the two, as well as when somebody picks up a pencil or picks up a piece of Conte or charcoal and draws with it, that's not their finger. They're using a prosthetic. And that prosthetic, they feel that prosthetic. That prosthetic goes right through to their brain doing it. So the musicians could extend out. They could extend out their whole repertoire past I have maybe 3 notes that I can sing, you know, and that's it. If I play an instrument, if I play an oboe, I can go 2.5 octaves. So I now have a voice that can go 2.5 octaves. So the musicians did it. They made their living from selling to patrons and selling their written music to patrons, who themselves would run into the same problem. They maybe, you know, as adults, could do no more than 3 notes. So they, in turn, bought the music to be able to play it on instruments. Somehow or another, that was acceptable, and that happened over a couple of 100 years. It didn't really come to a forefront where it actually worked very well. If you listen to Renaissance music, most of the time, everybody made their own instruments and everybody made up their own tonic. So if you listen to Renaissance music, most of the work is just trying to keep the instrument in tune with each other. So it's very hard to write counterpoint for that. As instruments developed and developed so that they actually could tune them to play with each other and come up with a tonic, which is the European tonic that we have, the 12-tone scale, and play them in tune and keep them in tune, then we get this great expansion of layered music that is totally abstract. And you can add a voice or not add a voice. It doesn't really matter whether for one thing, if you don't understand the language it's being sung in, it's just another voice within the music itself. So those layers were not painful. They don't seem to be nearly as painful because of the history of the way that it went. For the visual arts, this is a very tricky business. The very tricky business for the visual artist is again, what I will say, is it began with illustration. That's what you got paid for. And the illustration that you did, you had the innate ability to draw and reproduce something. Any artist that you know they start from illustration from the time they're little kids. They start illustrating things. So the ability to illustrate did something that was very, very important to anyone who wanted permanence. They gave permanence to both ideas, and they gave permanence to drawing and sculpting the warrior class and the ruling class. And by giving them permanence, they also gave them immortality. And that immortality was all part of the system of maintaining the structure, the feudal structure, no matter where that happens to be. It was the right to rule. So the artists performed that function. They did it, and I have a whole lot of stuff. If you look at the antique world, part of this is just the beginning of it. But if you go back to the original hieroglyphics, they will show perfect illustrations of battles won by pharaohs telling that. And that's why it's more than written history. When de Souza, this book that I use on the war in the ancient era, the whole first part of the book is just illustration, and that was the artist's role in that particular thing. So I think this is part of the really painful part of it. The photograph finally replaced that for the artist, and finally liberated the artist in the way, say, the well-tempered clavier did in the 18th century. But obviously, there's instruments that you could play before then. But I'm just saying as an example of being able to like temper a 12-tone instrument. So somehow or another, this has been a terrible, terrible transition, because once art became abstract and went into that abstract, it didn't matter whether there were figures in it or not figures in it, whether there were patterns in it or not patterns in it. That just simply doesn't matter. It's, does it work as art? And that is done in music, and was done in music hundreds of years ago. And it just was a terribly difficult transition somehow or another in the visual arts. And so why he's talking about the visual arts, it's 1953. He's got Jackson Pollock in there. He's got Sam Francis in there. These are American icons now. And then everybody was laughing at them. They said, my kid could do that, blah, blah, blah. What is that, blah, 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 blah. All that horrible stuff was going on back then. So he brought a legitimacy to that work. And he brought a legitimacy to American abstractionism, because he came from England. So he knew what he was doing. And what he was doing was he's giving a panoply of art history here in order to justify Sam Francis and do that in the end. That's exactly what I see here. And he had to do it that way. Nobody was going to listen. If he couldn't prove that Sam Francis and Jackson Pollock were at the apex of the evolution of art, then he had no future either. So, you know, he was looking at what he was doing in here, and is it right or is it wrong in retrospect? I don't know. What he was doing, he was legitimizing the art history that brought it to that evolutionary point. I have another point of view, and tomorrow I'll show it, which will show a different transition, because it will do it directly from an artistic point of view and pull this thing all together. This is a difficult way to pull it together because there were so many other prescriptive narratives on the way. And he picked and chose which prescriptive narrative he was going to use to get us here. Tomorrow I'll do it much more directly.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in response to your question about how artists responded to what Herbert Reed was doing and the ideas that he was putting forward, one artist in particular, the sculptor Henry Moore, and Herbert Reed were great friends and proponents of each other's work. They really supported one another, and Reed really held Moore and his work up as sort of a pinnacle of artistic achievement and did a lot to further his career and promote him. And that relationship was mutually beneficial to both of them. So I don't know about other artists, but Moore definitely really respected Reed, and they had a great relationship. Yes.
In developing this, I really think that the midpoint between your two narratives, which you need to flesh out for readers, is poetry. It's not the visual or the musical that Reed will be remembered for. It's the poetry, and the humanism that he represented was poetic. What I wonder about is, have you thought about how that fits in to his construction of these lectures? He has such a rich poetic corpus with multiple facets that have made choices too that of an aesthetic kind, which don't go in the direction of abstraction at all. You know, he goes back to William. That's why I was interested in the basket question. He's a fellow of William Morris, very much, in some ways, a child of William Morris, his socialist, anarchist outlook. And I think the poetry might be something for you to develop.
I don't know. More ideas out of left and or right field. I mean, one of the things that's happening in 1953, it seems to me, in the whole context of the word art, is that art had been used as a kind of way of distinguishing things that were good enough for the noble classes. And what is occurring with Reed is an attempt to remove that. The achievement of nobility was the mark of fine art. In many ways, this was partly just a market situation. Were you good enough that your stuff would be bought? Because only rich people could afford it. This is not only true, I mean, everything we call a fine art, opera and so on, requires an enormous amount of money. If you're just an ordinary dude, you can't get an orchestra of 65 guys together and pay them for the night. You just can't afford it, right? You need a record player, but there wasn't around yet, right? So what happens, partly what happens in Reed is he takes the focus off of what used to be called beauty. Now, beauty is a word that's oddly absent in our discussion so far, but I think there's a reason why it's gone. If you go back to the old philosophers, Greek philosophers, the ideal of achievement, in a sense, was human, and that was, what is the ideal human type? Virtue was the achievement of the highest human type. The highest human type, in part, was identified with warriors. Right through the Renaissance, people would identify Julius Caesar as the greatest man who ever lived. Right? Alexander often as well. But I mean, in part, the ideal human being could not, as Aristotle would say, be completely ugly, nor could the ideal human being be weak, nor could the ideal human being spend all his time chasing money. And there's all sorts of things that an ideal human being couldn't do. But part of what was thought is that you're seeking something called beauty, and the ideal human was beautiful. And this, the word we use for noble, comes from the old Greek word aristoi, is opposed to kakon, from which we get the word kaka, you know. So it was the base versus the noble. This entire notion is collapsing in 1953, along with the age of agriculture, which collapsed and on which this hierarchy was based. Right? And suddenly the artisan is being claimed, particularly by people on the left, as having just as much legitimacy as the artist, thank you very much, and making it into the salons is not an indicator of success. So what I see in Reed is an attempt to completely rediscover or reconceive of art in such a way that it is something everybody does. They confront the world and they try to make sense of it. And the original purpose is much closer to the ground that we all live on rather than someplace that only a few of us can afford to see. So that's partly what I see in Reed. I don't know if it's much of the story, but it's something that's going on.